Name your price. I'll free your daughter. The mountain man told the father to sell his obese girl. The winter of 1823 came early to the Montana Territory, painting the frontier in shades of ash and white. Snow had already begun its relentless assault on the high country when Elias Boone descended from his mountain sanctuary into Timber Falls, a settlement that had grown around the trading post like a scar on the landscape. He came down once every season, no more, no less, to exchange pelts for salt, coffee, and the few provisions that sustained his solitary existence in the cabin he'd built with his own hands a decade prior. Elias was a man of 43 winters, though his weathered face suggested he'd lived twice that many. His eyes, the color of a winter sky just before a storm, held the peculiar sadness that only comes from profound loss. The fur traders knew his reputation, silent, skilled, dangerous when provoked. The townspeople gave him a wide berth, and he preferred it that way. After the avalanche of 1813 had stolen his wife Margaret and infant son James, silence had become his only reliable companion. The trading post was crowded that December afternoon. Elias was examining a bolt of cloth, some instinct, some ghost of his old self, when the screaming began. At first, it was just voices raised in anger, the common friction of frontier life. But then he heard it, the sharp crack of leather against flesh, and a girl's cry of pain mixed with something else, not fear alone, but a kind of resignation, as if she'd been struck so many times that pain had become her native language. Elias's hand stilled on the cloth. Through the window, he could see them. A barrel-chested man with a face like aged beef, his fist raised, and before him, a girl, no, a young woman, with considerable girth and a face streaked with tears. Her dress was patched and faded, her hair matted, but her eyes, those eyes caught something in Elias, some spark he thought had died with his family. "Useless fat thing," the man bellowed. He was her father. Elias could see it in the set of her mouth, the shape of her fear. "Nothing but a burden. Eats like a horse and won't work. I should have drowned you with the litter." The girl flinched, her hands raised not in defense but in a gesture of helpless apology. Around them, townspeople averted their eyes. This was none of their business. A father had the right to discipline his children, especially a daughter who it seemed was considered a shame upon his household. Something broke in Elias that day. He moved without conscious decision, setting down the cloth and walking into the street. The cold air hit his face like a slap, but it felt clean compared to the filth he'd just witnessed. "Nay, name your price," Elias said, his voice cutting through the chaos like a rifle shot through still air. "I'll free your daughter." The crowd froze. The father turned to look at him, his face reddening further with a mixture of rage and confusion. For a moment, his fist remained raised as if suspended in time. "What in blazes did you say, mountain man?" the father snarled. His accent was Eastern, his pretensions obvious despite his rough appearance. He was a failed farmer, Elias decided, a man who resented everything and everyone for his own failures. "I said name your price." Elias reached into his saddlebag and withdrew a leather pouch heavy with gold coins. He'd been saving for 15 years, accumulating wealth that meant nothing to him in his exile. He let the pouch fall open, and coins spilled across the frozen ground, glinting in the weak December sun. "For the girl." The father's eyes widened. For a moment, pure avarice painted itself across his features. This was the language he understood, the only truth in his narrow world. Then, almost as quickly, something darker crossed his face. He looked at his daughter, at the stranger, and at the fortune spread before him. $100, he said finally, his voice hoarse with greed and humiliation. Without a word, Elias counted out the coins. More than 100, actually. He pressed 200 into the man's weathered palm, some part of him wanting to ensure the transaction could never be disputed or regretted by this brute. The father stared at the coins, then at Elias, then at his daughter. For just a moment, Something like shame flickered across his face. Then he turned and walked away, toward the saloon, the coins already disappearing into his pocket. In that moment, Elias understood that the man was already planning how to spend his sudden fortune on whiskey, not on redemption or reflection. The girl, Lydia, he would later learn, stood motionless, her round face blotchy with tears, her generous frame trembling with shock. "What's your name?" Elias asked gently. Lydia," she whispered. "Lydia Harris. I don't understand. Why would you—" She couldn't finish the sentence. The concept of kindness from a stranger was apparently so foreign to her that she lacked the vocabulary to express her confusion. "Can you walk?" he asked. She nodded mutely. "Then come. You don't belong here." He extended his hand, calloused and scarred from decades of mountain living. After a moment of hesitation, she took it. Her hand was soft and trembling, and Elias felt something stir in his chest, something he'd thought had been buried with Margaret. The journey to his cabin took 3 days. Elias had a mule and a horse, and he gave Lydia the horse. She'd never ridden before and was terrified, but she obeyed his quiet instructions without complaint. He watched her in those first hours with something like clinical detachment. She was overweight, certainly. Her body spoke of comfort in eating, perhaps the only comfort available to her in a harsh household. But as they rode deeper into the wilderness, away from the judgment of civilization, something began to change in her bearing. The defensive hunch to her shoulders eased. Her eyes, which had darted nervously at every sound, began to track birds and small animals with genuine curiosity. On the first night, they made camp in a grove of pine trees. Elias built a fire and prepared a simple meal of jerky and beans. Lydia ate quickly, as if afraid he might take the food away, but she didn't overeat. She was simply hungry in a way that suggested she'd known real deprivation. "Why did you do it?" she asked softly, when darkness had settled around them like a blanket. "Why did you buy me?" Elias poked the fire with a stick, watching sparks rise toward the stars. "I didn't buy you," he said finally. "I freed you. There's a difference." She didn't understand, he could see, but she didn't press the matter further. Instead, she wrapped herself in the blanket he'd given her and fell asleep by the fire, and Elias sat watching her, wondering what he'd done, what he was doing, and whether this was the most foolish act of his life or the least. The cabin was small but well built, constructed from logs Elias had harvested and shaped himself. It had a stone fireplace, a solid roof, and a single large room with a sleeping loft and a small storage area. The furnishings were sparse: a table, chairs, a large bed, which he gave to Lydia, a stove and shelves lined with preserved foods and supplies. It was a place built by a man who had learned to live with only what was necessary. In the first weeks, Lydia was almost completely silent. She moved through the cabin like a ghost, performing tasks slowly and carefully, as if terrified of making a mistake. Elias gave her simple work: tending the fire, preparing meals, keeping the space clean. He showed her how to organize the preserved vegetables and meats, how to measure flour, how to bring in firewood without straining herself unduly. She was a quick learner. Her hands, soft and unused to labor, gradually developed calluses. Her breathing, labored on their first days in the mountains, became easier. And her fear, that constant tremor in her voice and movements, began to settle and calm like sediment in still water. One afternoon in late January, as snow fell heavy and thick outside the cabin, Lydia stood at the window watching the mountains disappear behind veils of white. Elias was working at the table, cleaning traps and sorting pelts. The fire crackled and sparked, and the cabin was warm, filled with the smell of the stew Lydia had prepared. "I've never been this warm," she said suddenly, her voice small but clear. "Not in winter. At home, Father said heating the cabin too much was wasteful. We'd all huddle together in one room, and She trailed off, embarrassed. "You what?" Elias asked, not unkindly. "I was the largest, so they'd all huddle against me for warmth, and Father would—" He would say it was the only useful thing I was good for, being large. She turned away from the window, and Elias could see the shame burning in her cheeks. I'm sorry. I shouldn't complain. You've been kind to me. You're not complaining, Elias said. He set down the trap he'd been cleaning. You're talking. There's a difference. He paused, then added, You can talk here about anything. This is your home now. The word home seemed to shock her. Tears formed in her eyes, but she blinked them away quickly. Come, he said, standing. I'll teach you how to check the snares. Spring's coming and you should know how to do this. Might need to someday. As winter turned toward spring, Lydia became less a ghost and more a presence. She began to offer suggestions about organizing the stores, about how to better arrange the space, about little touches that made the cabin less austere. She made curtains from cloth Elias traded for in the fall. She created a small herb garden in a corner by the window, nurturing seedlings that grew strong and fragrant. She learned to identify plants in the forest and brought back wild greens and mushrooms. And she laughed. It started small, a quiet chuckle at a clumsy mistake Elias made with a fishing line. But it grew. Soon, the cabin was filled with the sound of her laughter, genuine and unafraid, and Elias realized he was smiling in response. Spring came gloriously to the mountains, arriving in a rush of green and warmth, and the sound of water running wild from melting snow. The forest woke from its long sleep, and Lydia seemed to wake with it. One afternoon in May, as Elias was splitting wood for the store, Lydia approached him with flowers in her hand. Mountain laurel, wild roses, columbine. She'd been gathering them all morning, he realized, preparing something. I want to make the cabin beautiful, she said, her voice steady and sure in a way it hadn't been months before. Not just useful, beautiful. Do you mind? He set down his axe. No, he said, I don't mind at all. She arranged the flowers in mason jars and set them throughout the cabin. The simple blooms transformed the space, bringing color and life and a sweetness that had been absent for so long. That evening, as they sat by the fire, Lydia on one side and Elias on the other, the distance between them felt both vast and impossibly small. But the calm of the mountains could not last forever. In late June, Elias made a trip to a neighboring settlement, nearly 2 days' journey away, to trade for supplies that couldn't be found in Timber Falls. He expected to be gone for a week at most. Lydia wanted to accompany him, but he insisted she stay behind and tend the garden. There were still dangers on the frontier, and he wanted to know she was safe. On the third day of his absence, disaster struck. A group of drifters, fleeing territorial law, had holed up in the mountains. Desperate and cruel, they came upon the cabin while Lydia was gathering water from the stream. She heard their rough voices before she saw them, and her first instinct was to run, to hide. She made it as far as the tree line before one of them caught her, but Lydia, despite her size, possessed a determination born of survival. She fought, and when she fought, she was surprisingly strong. Her scream echoed through the mountain valley, loud and desperate and full of a fury that surprised everyone, least of all herself. The commotion brought attention she hadn't anticipated. Elias was returning early. His business concluded faster than expected. He heard the scream while still a quarter-mile away, heard the rage and fear in it, and something in him that had been sleeping for a decade snapped awake. He found the scene in moments. Lydia struggling against 2 men while a third searched the cabin behind them. He saw red, not rage exactly, but something clearer and colder. The men with guns never knew what hit them. When it was over, Elias stood in his clearing, breathing hard, his hands steady despite the violence that had just been done. The men were dead or dying, scattered across the ground like broken dolls. Lydia sat on the grass, shaking, and Elias went to her immediately, dropping to his knees beside her. "Are you hurt?" His voice was urgent, searching. She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. No, I'm... You came back. He gathered her into his arms, and she clung to him like a drowning person to driftwood. They stayed that way for a long time, while the summer sun moved across the sky, and the mountains stood silent and eternal around them. That night, they didn't sleep in separate areas for the first time. Lydia was too frightened to be alone, and Elias couldn't bear to leave her. He built up the fire and sat in a chair while she lay on the bed, her eyes following his movements until exhaustion finally claimed her. And Elias, watching over her in the flickering firelight, felt something he hadn't experienced in a decade, the weight of responsibility for another life, and the fierce protectiveness that comes with genuine love. The summer passed quietly after that. The territorial marshal came and investigated the incident, but sided with Elias immediately. The drifters were known criminals, and Elias had done what any man would do to protect his household. That word, household, hung in the air between them, and neither felt the need to question it. As the season turned, Lydia blossomed in ways that went beyond the physical. She was still a large woman, but her size now seemed to speak of strength rather than shame. She moved with confidence, her voice carried clearly, and she made decisions about the homestead without seeking permission. The cabin was no longer Elias's refuge. It had become their home. One warm evening in August, as they sat on the porch watching the sun paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Lydia took Elias's hand. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked softly. "Buying me? It was a lot of money." "I told you," Elias said, turning to look at her. "I didn't buy you." He paused, then added, "And no, never. Not for a moment." She squeezed his hand. "I love you," she said simply. "I've loved you since that day in the square, maybe, but certainly since the first night in the cabin. I wanted to tell you, but I was afraid you'd think I was being ungrateful or silly." Elias turned fully toward her, and in the golden light of the sunset, she could see his eyes were wet. He'd been a man alone for so long that expressing emotion felt foreign, almost impossible. But for Lydia, he found the words. "I love you too," he said. "I've been afraid to acknowledge it because love is what brought me pain before. But you've taught me that love can also bring joy. That pain and joy can exist together, and that's what it means to truly live." He kissed her then, gently at first, then with growing passion, years of loneliness and years of careful waiting pouring into that single moment. Lydia responded with a tenderness that made his heart ache, and when they separated, both of them were crying. "Marry me," Elias said, the words seemingly coming from somewhere outside himself. "Not because society demands. Marry me because you want to, because I want to spend the rest of my life knowing you're here. And the last thing I hear before sleep." "Yes," Lydia said immediately. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." They were married in a small ceremony in Timber Falls that autumn by a Methodist preacher who'd recently arrived. The whole town turned out, curious to see the mountain man and the girl he'd freed actually seal their union. Lydia wore a dress of pale blue that one of the town women had helped her make, and her hair was arranged in an elegant style that made her look like the lady she was becoming. Elias wore a suit that felt strange against his weathered frame, but his eyes never left Lydia's face. By winter of their first married year, the Boone homestead had changed in ways that surprised even Elias. That was when the first child came to them, not their own, but no less their responsibility. Elias was trading in the settlement when he heard the boy's cries. He was perhaps 8 years old, thin as a rail and covered in bruises. The owner of the trading post, a cruel man named Gentry, was beating him for supposedly stealing bread. Without a moment's hesitation, Elias intervened. "How much for the boy?" he asked, already reaching for his purse. Gentry laughed. "You want to buy a useless urchin? Why, he's nothing but a thief and a burden. No one wants—" Elias didn't let him finish. He laid out money, more than enough, and collected the boy, whose name was Thomas. Thomas resisted at first, terrified that this brutal stranger was taking him somewhere worse. But when Elias brought him home to Lydia, the boy's suspicions slowly melted into wonder. Lydia fed him, cleaned his wounds, and gave him a place by the fire. Within a week, Thomas was calling her Miss with a tentative hope in his voice. Within a month, he was calling her Mother. The second child came the following spring. Elias found her in the forest, abandoned by travelers who couldn't feed another mouth through the winter. She was only 5 years old, and she'd survived by eating bark and sleeping in hollow logs. Her name was Emma, and she was mute from shock and trauma. Lydia took her in without question, and over months of patient kindness, Emma began to speak again. Her first word was Mama. Then there was Samuel, a half-native boy rejected by both communities. Then little Rosie, a girl who'd been sold as a servant and was too weak to work. Each time Elias came to the homestead with a new addition to their family, Lydia's eyes would light with joy rather than concern. "We're building something good here," she told Elias one winter evening, watching the children sleep by the fire. Thomas and Emma curled up together, Rosie tucked between them, Samuel on the bear rug that had belonged to Elias long before. "We're building a place where broken things can be healed." "We're building a family," Elias corrected gently. "A real family." And in the spring of 1826, Lydia gave him something more, their own child. She went into labor on a morning when the mountains still held snow in their crevices, when the world was caught between winter and spring. Elias had sent for the midwife from the settlement, a kind-hearted woman named Ruth, who arrived just in time to assist. It was a long labor, difficult and painful, but Lydia endured it with the same strength and determination that had carried her through everything else. Their son was born as the sun began to set, painting the cabin in shades of rose and gold. He was perfect and healthy, with his mother's lighter coloring and what Elias was certain were his own stubborn features. They named him James, after Elias's son from his first marriage, and when Elias held the boy, he felt that final wound in his heart, the one that had ached for 13 years, begin to heal. "Look what we made," Lydia whispered, exhausted and radiant. "Look what we made from all that pain." Elias looked at his wife, at his newborn son, at the other children sleeping nearby, at the cabin filled with warmth and light and life. 13 years ago, he'd come into these mountains to die, slowly and deliberately. Instead, he'd found life in a girl beaten down by her father's cruelty, and together they'd built something extraordinary. The years that followed became legend in Montana territory. Travelers told stories of the Boone Homestead, a place deep in the mountains where broken people found wholeness, where kindness was a daily practice, and where a mountain man and his wife had created something that transcended the harsh realities of frontier life. The children flourished. Thomas became Elias's hunting partner and second father to the younger ones. Emma, her voice restored, sang around the cabin. Samuel grew strong and skilled. Rosie learned to cook and keep house, and young James, as he grew, showed every sign of becoming a leader among the mountain folk. By 1835, the Boone homestead had expanded to include a larger main house, a stable, a smokehouse, and several smaller cabins for the various hands that worked the property. But more importantly, it had become a sanctuary. People knew that if they arrived at the Boone homestead hungry, they would be fed. If they arrived broken, they would be healed. If they arrived lost, they would find their way. Elias was 62 now, his beard entirely silver, his eyes still that winter sky blue but now warm with decades of love and purpose. Lydia was in her mid-40s, her blonde hair threaded with silver, her generous frame moving with the confidence and authority of a woman who had known her true worth. Together, they were the heart of a small empire of kindness. One particular visitor would later become famous in the territory's history books. A young man arrived in the winter of 1837, badly injured from a conflict with Cheyenne warriors over rights to hunting grounds. He was the nephew of a territorial governor, educated and refined, and initially resistant to being helped by what he assumed was a rough mountain family. But Lydia, who had seen prejudice and understood its corrosive nature, simply smiled and set about nursing him back to health. It was this young man who, years later, would write a series of articles in the territory's newspapers about the Boone family and the redemption of the frontier. In his writings, he described Elias not as a man who bought a woman, but as a man who understood something fundamental, that everyone, no matter how battered or broken, deserved a chance at dignity and love. "I have met many people in my travels," the young man wrote, "but none have moved me more than to witness the simple grace of the Boones in their mountain home. Here is proof that the frontier need not be brutal, that civilization need not mean city walls, and that love is not weakness, but the greatest strength of all." The articles were published widely, and people came from back east to see for themselves if such a place truly existed. Some came as skeptics, some as believers. All left changed. In 1840, when Lydia became pregnant again, the whole territory seemed to hold its breath. She was older now, and the pregnancy was difficult. Elias, for the first time in years, knew real fear. He sat by her side every moment, held her hand through the contractions, and whispered prayers to gods he'd stopped believing in years ago. Their daughter was born on a spring morning, and the midwife immediately knew something was wrong. The baby wasn't breathing. Her tiny face blue. But Lydia, even in her exhaustion and pain, managed to gather enough strength to turn her body, to open her eyes, to say to Elias with absolute certainty, "Save her. Save our daughter." And Elias, who had saved so many, found himself unable to save this one. The baby died in his hands, and Lydia wept as she'd never wept before. Not even at her own father's cruelty. But she survived the childbirth, and her capacity to grieve and then to move forward became yet another testament to her strength. The family buried the infant. They named her Sarah in honor of Lydia's mother, beneath a pine tree that overlooked the valley. It became a place they all visited together, acknowledging that life was not always redemption, that sometimes pain simply was pain, and that love persisted even in grief. The years after that birth became years of consolidation. The children matured. Thomas and Emma married, not to each other, but to good people from nearby communities. Their weddings were celebrated at the homestead, with a joy that seemed to reverberate through the mountains themselves. Samuel became a skilled woodworker, creating beautiful furnishings that traders came from settlements for. Rosie managed the household with an efficiency that would have impressed any Eastern manor housekeeper. Young James, the child of Elias and Lydia's love, grew into a man who seemingly inherited the best traits of both parents. He had Elias's steady competence and quiet strength, and Lydia's innate kindness and ability to see the best in people. He began to take on more responsibility for the homestead, and Elias, watching him, felt the peculiar satisfaction of a man who would leave behind something worthwhile. On a morning in the spring of 1845, when Elias was 72 and Lydia was 56, they sat together on the porch of their homestead, watching the sun rise over the mountains that had given them shelter and solace. "Do you remember," Lydia asked softly, her hand finding his, "that day in the square in Timber Falls?" "Every day of my life," Elias replied. "I was so afraid," Lydia continued. "I'd been beaten down for so long that I'd started to believe what my father said, that I was useless, that I was a burden, that the world would be better without me." Elias turned to her, his weathered face tender with love. "And now?" "Now I know," Lydia said, turning to meet his gaze, "that I was just waiting. I was waiting for someone who could see me not as a burden to bear or a body to abuse, but as a person worthy of love. You did that. You gave me my life back." You gave me mine back, Elias said. When I found you, I was already dead. I just didn't know it yet. You brought me back to life. They sat in silence, watching the light spread across the mountains, and understanding, as only two people who have truly known each other could, that they had been saved, each by the other, in ways that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with the fundamental human need to be truly seen and loved for who you are. When Elias died, 5 years later, in his sleep with Lydia's hand in his, the whole territory mourned. Even those who'd never met him knew his name, knew his story, understood what he represented. The mountain man who'd learned to love. The man who'd understood that redemption isn't a single moment, but a lifetime of choices to see the best in people and give them chances to be better. Lydia lived another 20 years after his death, long enough to see her children and their children flourish, long enough to host countless people at the homestead, long enough to become a legend herself, the woman who'd turned a mountain cabin into a sanctuary, who'd raised children of many backgrounds and colors, who'd built something that lasted. The territory would remember the Boones long after their deaths. The homestead became a way station for traders and travelers, a place that seemed to embody something essential about what the frontier could be. Not just brutality and survival, but kindness and community and love. And in the mountains of Montana, people would tell the story of a mountain man and a girl, of a rescue that was also a transformation, of two broken people who found wholeness in each other and spent the rest of their lives building it in others. It was a love story, but not the kind found in books. It was the kind found in a life lived with intention and grace, in a commitment to see the humanity in others and to honor it with kindness. It was the kind that changes the world.